Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jonica Moore, health expert for healthy women, and your guest host for today. On today's episode of Women Talk, we're bringing our conversation to the bedroom. We'll be destigmatizing sexual health, discussing how to achieve more sexual pleasure, how to talk to your partner or partners about sexual pleasure, and when pain in the bedroom is a sign of something a little more serious. Thank you for all for joining us for this sex positive and informative episode. Now, today we have two very special guests on our show. Dr. Shannon Chavez, a licensed psychologist and ASEX certified sex therapist in Beverly Hills, California. She's a nationally recognized expert, therapist, and educator specializing in all things sexuality. And we welcome guest Tracy McNeil, president and CEO of Materna Medical, a healthcare executive with specialty in commercializing medical devices. With 6 successful transactions and over 20 years in pharmaceuticals, digital health, and women's health, she brings a wealth of experience to the med tech industry. Welcome, ladies. I am so thrilled to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
So let's dive right in with our first question. And what we're going to talk about today is how we can have better sex. And I think we all agree that communication is really integrally important to that. So, what advice do you have for talking about sex, and why is that so important?
Well, I definitely think that when it comes to talking about sex, we need to find the language that we feel comfortable with. Often it feels very vulnerable because we don't know how to describe what's going on, or we feel embarrassed talking about it. So, finding a language that you feel comfortable with. I also feel like less is more. Sometimes we over explain because we don't know how our partners or our doctors are going to respond to what it is that we're going through. So it's important to just be direct and be very clear in terms of what you're aware of that's going on with your body. So if it's understandable to you, it's easier to describe it to someone else.
And Tracy, I know that you are passionate about destigmatizing many aspects of talking about sex in general, but also particularly sexual pain or discomfort.
That's right. And just building on what Dr. Chavez was saying, that a lot of times people don't have the right language to talk about or describe. From a young age, women in particular are often taught that there's not any polite words for anything below the waist. So they may not feel comfortable saying if something doesn't feel good. So I think that one of the topics that we're going to be talking about today is both how to ask for what you want to get more pleasure, but also how to describe what's going on when things don't feel good or when things are painful.
So, of course, there's all kinds of people that we need to talk about the importance of communication, and especially even our children talking about the right words to use to describe various anatomical parts. But Shannon, let's start with what's your advice to talking to your partners about sexual pleasure, or in particular, if you're experiencing any kind of pain or discomfort during sex?
That's a good point. We should talk about when things are going well as well as things that aren't going well. So to bring the conversation of sex even outside of the bedroom, I often recommend going on a walk with a partner. That way you're both walking together in the same direction and having a conversation about something that's important in your relationship. I think taking the conversation out of the bedroom allows you to look at sex as a big part of the relationship, not just this thing we do, but a part of our intimacy, a way we connect. So I think that start slow with the conversation. We're not figuring it out in one dialogue, that it's a commitment to collaborating together in partnership to figure out the solution. And for many couples, that's figuring it out from ground zero, getting some good information together, maybe going to a doctor's visit together or going to therapy together, so that it's something that you can do as a couple and don't feel alone and isolated, or that one of you is responsible to figure it out on your own.
One of the things I've always been fascinated by is how people can have sex with each other with no problem, but have more difficulty talking about having sex with each other. And speaking about taking the conversation out of the bedroom, at what point does it become more of a going on a walk conversation to going to a sex therapist conversation?
I would say when couples feel stuck, right? They have different perspectives, different goals, different desires, and they can't seem to come to a place of agreement or understanding. And they might need someone to help mediate that conversation, to help the maybe reactions. Maybe we have certain ways we're reacting to a partner's desire or expectation around sex. So often we can't be very reactive, especially if we feel blamed or if we feel responsible. So we may feel that, all right, I get defensive when a partner talks about what we're not having enough sex or some of the problems that come up. So I would say sex therapy would come in if you're feeling stuck. We've gone at it for a while. We don't know how to get out of this argument or conflict, and we need some support.
So, speaking of the words that we use to describe sex and sexual anatomy and reproductive health, the medical term for sexual discomfort or sexual pain is dyspareunia. And big words. And one of the things, Tracy, that we know causes dyspareunia are problems with the tightness of the pelvic floor. But the pelvic floor itself, those two words, are not something that most women even know are part of their anatomy. So, would you like to start with a discussion of that, and how does that relate to sexual pain or dyspareunia?
Absolutely. Well, so it's amazing. It's such an unconscious part of our bodies. So all people have a pelvic floor. The way I think about it is it's like a basket of muscles at the bottom of our trunk. I mean, basically all of our guts are sitting on top of our pelvic floor, and it's a basket holding it all up. And what's interesting is because it's this basket, it has small openings for all the tubes that come in and out of our bodies, depending on what we're made of, right? So to pee and poop and have sex, it has to go through this web of muscles. And so that's really what's going on. And overactive pelvic floors are very common for both men and women. And painful sex is one of the symptoms. So we can talk more about other kinds of dyspareunia. That's not the only cause of dyspareunia. Actually, there's a bunch, and I'd love to share them. But that's really what's going on. That's why the pelvic floor is an important part of the discussion of both avoiding getting through painful sex as well as getting to the other side and actually enjoying it.
And when you're talking about an overactive pelvic floor, what you're really talking about are muscular contractions.
Yeah, chronic tightness. So if you think about, so maybe we can talk a little bit about dyspareunia, painful sex. That can happen. I think ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, cites that 3 out of 4 women will have painful sex at some point in their lives. 3 out of 4. It's extremely common. It can be yeast infections, super temporary, chronic yeast infections, more chronic. But if it can be menopause, where the tissue's drier or thinner, sex starts to hurt. Cancer survivors can receive radiation vaginally. Chemotherapy puts women into a sudden menopause. Childbirth injuries, endometriosis, fibroids, like so many reasons that women can have painful sex. So we're really,
and those are just some of the physical reasons. There's also a whole list of psychosocial and psychological reasons as well.
Exactly.
So, of course, the most common reason is vaginal dryness. And of course, Shannon, passing it over to you, what's the most common cause of vaginal dryness?
Oh, there can be so many things. It can definitely be hormonal changes. There can be even things that we're doing in our lifestyle, medication that we're taking. Stress can be a big component. Even taking over-the-counter allergy medication can change your natural vaginal lubrication. So I think that's one thing we want to educate women is that it can change over time. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a major concern or problem, but to get in tune with our bodies and know that these changes can be common. And if it is problematic, to know where to go for support.
I think what I was trying to lead you to is the number one reason for lack of lubrication is just not being in the mood or not being ready.
Yes.
Or being angry with your partner, not wanting to speak with them, let alone engage.
Yes, our brain is our biggest sex organ. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Getting turned on really requires, being in our, mind and body, being in our desire, understanding what feels good, which I know a lot of, women especially are very disconnected from their own desire.
Mm-hmm. And putting words to it. So, of course, one of the other big reasons you mentioned are all these hormonally sensitive times in our lives. Talk to me about perimenopause and how that can really influence vaginal lubrication, also any kind of lack of decreased sexual desire, or how that can influence painful sex or sexual discomfort.
Absolutely. I think there's hormonal changes. They're going to happen inevitably to all women, but there's not necessarily, what we do to prevent or prepare for this. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions or myths, especially about perimenopause being a very negative thing. I think if you are getting the right support and you know how to navigate those changes, then you'll also know how to deal with the ebbs and flows of things like desire. So when we think about low libido or desire during perimenopause, it's not a constant state, but hormones are cycling and our bodies are changing. So I think the biggest thing to support ourselves is to be able to adjust to the changes, be able to know what's going on in our bodies, and to talk about it. I know a lot of women are going through perimenopause and don't realize they're going through it, or maybe they're being diagnosed as something else. I definitely see that in my practice: depression, anxiety, mood swings, and irritability. And yet normalizing it and knowing that it's perimenopause helps women know where to start. What types of products can I use? Maybe I do need to see a gynecologist for some hormonal support, but then also to be able to talk to someone about those changes. We don't necessarily have these conversations regularly with friends or socially. It feels something shameful for some women. So I think normalizing it helps us know how to kind of claim it in a way. Menopause doesn't have to be a negative thing.
So we throw around these terms like perimenopause and menopause, and we expect that most people know what they are. But the number one question I get is, what is perimenopause? And what I like to say is it's the evil younger sister of menopause. So it can actually start anywhere from 2 years to 10 years before menopause. And I think this surprises a lot of women that they can have menopausal symptoms while they're still having periods, although their periods may start to become irregular. So, Tracy, how does perimenopause or menopause affect the pelvic floor?
So, pushing off of what you were saying earlier, Dr. Moore, as the tissue's drier and thinner and the basket of muscles gets tight, as people start to know that sex is going to hurt. So maybe for the first 20 years they were sexually active, sex wasn't painful and lubrication wasn't a problem. But as the tissue becomes drier and thinner and there's not as much lubrication, the body begins to anticipate the pain and tightens up. So it's really an involuntary tightening. And the word here is involuntary. Like, you can't just tell the person to relax, right? There are some techniques and we can talk about them, but it is a mind-body thing. So not only are you having a dryness issue, now you're also having a size issue.
Well, and you're also having an anticipatory issue.
Exactly.
That it's going to happen. So talk to us about what what vaginismus is.
Yeah, so it's getting a lot of popular play in the media, and I'm so glad, because ACOG, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, estimates that between 5 and 17% of all women will have vaginismus in their lifetime. It's an incredibly common condition. And what it is that involuntary contraction of the pelvic floor in anticipation of wanted penetration. So that could be sexual intercourse, but it could also be a tampon or a pelvic exam. And it's really just even a finger inserted can cause an involuntary contraction of the muscles of the pelvic floor that we were talking about before. It's got this term vaginismus. It's not a term that most people who have vaginismus would recognize. So I'm super grateful for Healthy Women for getting this educational session out, because it's not only common, it's treatable.
Well, not only Healthy Women is getting the word out, but we're also seeing this now even becoming part of our pop culture in television shows like The Sex Lives of College Girls and Sex Education. So the good news is these television shows and other things in our culture are encouraging, in a way, a dialogue and an understanding of what that is. So
Yeah.
what are and you know what, I also want to give you a shout out that women-led tech and innovation companies are starting to focus on this. So what are some approaches that can treat vaginismus?
So the standard of care was invented sort of in the 1800s, and they're called
Ignoring it.
Yeah, they're called dilators. They're a set of essentially dildos
Mhm.
that women can insert sequentially. So in sizes, starting sort of at the size of your pinky and then ending at the size of your partner. Um, they so that's one option. There's also one expanding dilator on the market. So it goes in the size of the pinky and then the patient expands it inside the anatomy. So there's only one insertion per treatment with vibration also to help get blood flow to the tissue. And then there's just relaxation, mind body. I have to give a big shout out to pelvic floor physical therapists.
Mhm.
It's a massively growing part of physical therapy, but pelvic floor physical therapists are enormously helpful. There are resources online to help find them. There's not one in every zip code, and they're overbooked. But those are some of the things that people can do to try to help relax a chronically tight pelvic floor.
We don't even have gynecologists in every zip code anymore, but that's a whole another show. Um, so, obviously we could talk about this all day, but what I want to do is get to our questions from our viewers, and I want to encourage everybody to put your questions in the chat so we can address them for as much time as we have. But just as we close this more formal section, I want to hear from both of you, and Shannon, we'll start with you about what's your hope for women going forward about owning their sexuality and taking more initiative with addressing any sexual issues they have, whether it's increasing pleasure or addressing pain.
Yes, take control of your pleasure. Learn about your body. I mean, I don't know how many women I meet that are still learning about their anatomy and how their body functions. So I think taking control of your pleasure is learning what feels good for you. Sexuality doesn't have to be intimidating. There are so many ways that we can experience sexual pleasure, even outside of intercourse. So with painful sex, we hear a lot about intercourse and focusing on outer course, sensual focus on the body. There are so many ways for us to experience pleasure. So my goal for women is to be creative, take that initiative, read some books, go to a retreat, a workshop. There's so many great ways for women to feel more empowered around sex. So have fun with it, take some friends, and definitely contact us. We have plenty of options to recommend.
And there will be more resources for women also in the chat. Tracy, what's your view on this very important question about owning your sexuality?
Well, I couldn't say it better than Dr. Chavez. So I'll just say that, and that at Materna Medical, we deeply believe that when women are happy and healthy, everyone is happier and healthier. So trusting that asking for what you want, listening to your body, whether it's less pain or more pleasure, trusting that asking for what you want is what's best for everyone.
That is a great concluding statement. So now let's take some questions from our audience. The first is from Tanya. How can I explain to my partner that I've been feeling pain during sex? Shannon, this is all you.
All right, communication. Here we go. Definitely start with just a simple dialogue. Remember, you're not solving all the problems in one conversation. So, talking about your experience, and I think with pain, we may be afraid to talk to partners because they may feel blamed or responsible. But I think you want to talk about it from your perspective. What is the goal and intention? The intention is to have better experiences sexually. So, set the intention first. I'm talking about my pain because I want to have better experiences. I want to inform you so that we can work together to try different things or experiment a bit so that it's less painful or figure out a solution. So I would say having that intention in mind and remembering to have more conversations around it. I think sometimes couples have a big conversation all in one, but to really break it down and make a commitment to starting to make changes so sex is more enjoyable for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I would just point out also that painful sex or sexual discomfort is not limited to one gender. This is something that all people may experience at some point. Tracy, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
I think that was really well said. I think just remembering that, building on what Dr. Chavez was saying, it can make the partner feel defensive. And what I've seen with our folks is that both parties can feel guilty or somehow inadequate. And just trusting that neither of you is wrong or bad in any way, that this is something you can work on together, and remembering that there are all different kinds of sex too.
Well, that's a very good point. And I should have pointed out at the beginning that when we talk about painful sex in this episode of Women Talk, We're talking about that when that's not the goal. In some, cases, people choose that, and that's a whole nother conversation. But we're talking about when it's unwanted. All right, our next question from Natalie. How do you know whether you should, this is a great question. How do you know whether you should see a gynecologist or a sex therapist? Shannon.
All right, great question. I would think that it's always good to work integratively when you're dealing with a sexual concern. Some are physiological, and I always recommend a medical rule out because you can do some basic testing and exams that we're not able to do, obviously, as talk therapists, but I recommend doing both. You don't know whether or not it has a physiological or psychological component, and often having a team helps you work together. So I often get referrals from gynecologists, or I'll meet with a client and make a referral if needed to a specialist. So I think that whether you're starting with one or the other, that your clinician will make a good assessment of where is the best place to start.
Yeah, I actually had a patient once who had pretty classic vaginismus, and I thought that's what we were dealing with. And I examined her putting the speculum in the opposite direction and found she just had a cut, a physical cut on the inside of her vaginal wall. And every time anything, and she was in a lot of pain with the speculum, anything opened up this cut. It was probably a fingernail. So you never know what you're going to find. All right, next question from Melissa. If sex hurts, how can I get my partner to be supportive? All right, Tracy, you want to go first on this one?
Sure. And there are some good blogs online to help with partner conversations. I do recommend. The number one thing for partners to know is that pushing is counterproductive. So helping them understand that less is more, gentleness, patience, relaxation, no pressure. Pressure only makes the anticipatory tightness and the feelings of inadequacy worse. So it's kind of a Jedi mind trick, really, but it really is about relaxation and unconditional love.
Shannon, do you have anything to add to that?
I would say that bringing your partner in for support. So talking about it again as a partnered issue, because sometimes partners then, when we hear about painful sex, will avoid sex. Right now, I don't want to hurt you. So it's not about stopping all activity. I actually encourage looking for things that work. This actually feels good. If I'm dealing with pain in a particular place, there are still other ways we can explore pleasure. So the support of a partner is to get them on board, to try different things, to explore, to talk about, or even show a partner where things hurt and also where things might feel more pleasurable, to have some real interactive ways to connect and understand pain in a deeper way.
And of course, the bottom line in this question is it all depends on what the cause of the pain is.
Right.
It all depends on if you've always had pain with sex or if it's a new thing. Obviously, it's going to be a very different approach. If you have pain with sex because of a yeast infection, which is extremely common, nothing is going to make that better other than treating the yeast infection. All right. Our next question is from Caroline. What is your advice for women who have trouble reaching orgasm and just increasing sexual pleasure in general? Okay, Shannon.
Oh, I love this question.
That's your favorite question.
Women are not alone. We are not born knowing how to orgasm. Everything around our sexuality is learned. So orgasm is kind of like learning a language. The younger we do it in life, when those connections are made, the more our body is primed for pleasure, but we can learn how to do that. And that is my advice, to take some time to learn your body. I recommend doing some self-exploration, vulvar massage, priming your body, using a vibrator. I even wore my favorite vibrator necklace today. They come in all shapes and sizes. And so it really does take practice. I know we don't like to think about sexuality requiring practice, but when we allow ourselves space to learn orgasm, we realize our body's full potential. I mean, female bodies can have 10 different orgasm types. So our body is kind of primed and wired to feel good. But a lot of women may not know that. So educating yourself about pleasure, understanding that orgasm is a full body experience, and just figuring out what your body likes. Some people like, neck kisses, and that can bring them to an orgasm. Some women can think themselves off. So we don't have to orgasm all the same way. So I'm going to give you all permission to figure out what works for your body.
Tracy, do you have anything you want to add to that? Oh, that was pretty conclusive.
That was pretty conclusive. Beautiful.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes, Joy. How does technology affect sex life? Tracy, I'm gonna let you take this one.
Well, my
Aside
special
from the vibrator that Shannon's wearing around her neck.
yeah, well, my specialty is really around vaginismus, so I'm going to take that angle and then I'll pass to Dr. Chavez. So vaginismus, being as common as it is, as treatable as it is, typically does involve dilator therapy. So if you have an expanding dilator, for example, you could use it as preparation for sex. We see that fairly often. So not something necessarily that the person with the vagina has to go off and do the dilation, but bringing the partner in, using the innovation to bring them closer together.
Shannon, do you have anything to add to that?
I love that point because you were talking about technology in terms of pleasure devices. And that's definitely what I would say is the technology we want to bring into the bedroom. And I would say leaving out things like your phone, television. So I think, what I see a lot with partners is technology is impacting sex a lot. It's a distraction. It's taking a lot of our libido. A lot of our energy is going with the stimulation with devices. So I definitely recommend boundaries around technology and devices, especially we're talking about the technology that gets in the way, and maybe looking at things that you can bring into your sexual intimacy that could be useful technology, toys, devices, products, games, interactive ways that you can both connect rather than one of you using a device and the other not feeling included or involved.
So basically, device is good unless they have an apple on them.
Yes, that's a good way to remember it.
Okay, we have a question from Elle. Can you talk about different orgasm types? So Shannon, you said there were 10 different types of
There's a
female
lot.
orgasm.
I'll go through them really quickly. So we have, clitoral orgasm. We have an internal orgasm that used to be called a G-spot orgasm, but it's really part of the internal clitoris. We have a cervical orgasm. We have a multi-sensory orgasm. We have an orgasm that allows us to think ourselves off. And we can have pleasure, anal orgasms. So basically, my thing to remember about orgasm types is anywhere on the body where there is a bundle of nerves, we can feel a orgasm response. So that's why it's important to prime your body, because you never know where an orgasm is going to be released.
That was a great and very succinct way to wrap up. And we could talk about this all day, all week, all the time. I want to thank both of you for your very insightful comments. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today for another, very intimate, impactful conversation on Women Talk. Mostly I want to thank Healthy Women for allowing me to co-host this episode. It's my favorite web series. And I want to invite everyone to join us for our next episode of Women Talk, Healthy for the Holidays, on December 14th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And also, if you've missed any of our past episodes of Women Talk, please visit the Women Talk page on healthywomen.org. Again, thank you to our guests. Thank you to our audience for taking time out of your busy schedules. And thank you, of course, for sharing your expertise with us. We will see you next time on Healthy Women's Women Talk.